last speaker for the opposition has spoken, we will give the opportunity for all speakers to give some short rebuttal responses to what they heard, and then after that we'll then have it. So now, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our final speaker for the opposition. Oh!
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to my colleague and also to the proposition. Interesting points you raise, and I respect them, but I will leave the other to the question and answers for the rebuttal. Yeah. But I'll just keep with my speech. So I speak to you not only as a Muslim, but also as someone who is a liberal conservative. Someone who is, yes, an Englishman who embraced Islam 25 years ago. Now, some people may think, well, what on earth do I know about Islam? But I have been a Muslim for a quarter of a century, and I've studied under classical teachers of Islam, such as Dr. Tariq Qadri, Maulana Sheikh Nasim, Sheikh Dawood Rasa Owen, people who have been well grounded within classical Islam. So actually, my presentation is not relying so much on reform movements, but actually on what classical Islam represents. But of course, there are many different kinds of Islam. So Islam's not a monolith. I mean, if you think of Christianity and you think of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, all the different Protestant movements, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, you have the equivalent within the Islamic world. And, you know, who are real Muslims and who aren't real Muslims? Well, that's something for Muslims themselves to figure out. And obviously, you've got as many different views on that as you would within the Christian, group of the world. So just put that first. Interestingly, Islam has more connections with the West than what many people may realize. Core values of liberal democracy and classical Islam are mutually reinforcing. Principle of justice. Islam says, this is in the Quran. In Islam, you who believe, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kin. I was one of the first people to speak up for the Yazidis when they were attacked. I've always spoken out against any kind of terrorist attacks, and also on October the 7th, and also when Muslims are affected as well. Equally, across the board, a human being is a human being, and this is a principle within the Quran. Liberal democracy requires equal treatment under the law, accountability in governments. This is something that a lot of Muslims and people in the West share. Not all, but that's also true of people in the West as well. Interestingly, I take issue with this idea that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I'll say it once, I'll try not to say it later on because this is a very secular place. But it is tradition that we bless the Prophet the first time we mention him. I take issue with the fact that some people think he was some kind of dictator. In a sense, he was a kind of king when he went to Medina because he was invited to be there. And if you bear in mind, Islam is a religion that's 1400 years old. So the kind of governments that we have today didn't exist anywhere 1400 years ago. You think of what kind of government we had 1400 years ago here. We were ruled by Saxons and Vikings. And I mean, they were also really, thoughtful towards minorities and very respectful. So it's like, yeah, it's a bit rich, But interestingly, the Prophet Muhammad actually ruled according to mutual consultation. He actually ruled according to a form of Greek-style democracy with his community. This is also mentioned in the Quran itself. There is a whole chapter called Ashura. Ashura can be translated as parliament or council. And it says in the Quran, those who conduct their affairs by mutual consultation. This is in the Quran, the Surah 42, or the chapter 42, verse 38. And liberal democracy, of course, is founded on this principle. Human dignity and equality. It says in the Quran, in Surah 17, verse 70, we have indeed honored the children of Adam. That means all of the children of Adam, whatever faith or belief people take on. Now I realize there are some extremist groups out there, and there's some kinds of Muslims that they twist things. But I and many other Muslims recognize the equality of all human beings under God. So human rights, in fact, human rights here. I actually went to a human rights conference in 2019 with Sunni and Shia scholars from across the world. I was invited as a British representative to that. And they were discussing a book by the great grandson of the Prophet Muhammad on human rights. That's long before that we had any concept of human rights here. So Islam actually has a historical legacy of pluralism. I'm not suggesting it was perfect, but it is interesting that the Prophet himself, when he was in Medina, and he was invited there to be their leader because they were warring factions before he got there. And when he got there, he actually drew up a constitution of Medina. In that constitution, it says the Jews of Bani Auf are one community with the believers. The Jews have their religion and the Muslims have theirs. And we are one ummah. We are one nation. Where in Europe at that particular time, 1400 years ago, was anybody saying that the Christians and the Jews are one nation and they have different religions? How many of the nations in Europe are persecuting Jews and other minorities? Those that honored the constitution of Medina never had any problems in Medina. There were some Jewish tribes, they committed treason against the state, and it was because of that. And while it's true, Muhammad did fight against them, so alongside him were Jewish people who were still signed onto the constitution, and they did too, because these tribes committed treason. It wasn't about them being Jewish. I'm not saying that would have been a pretty sight. Fighting never is. But at the same time, it is interesting the principles upon which it happened. So it wouldn't be exactly like what we enjoy today, but for the times, it was quite interesting and way ahead of its time. Even during the Ottoman Empire, which I take was no perfect example, and certainly by today's standards, but there was a millet system which allowed the different religions to live together. The Christians were allowed to judge the Christian community. They had their own system, the Jews theirs and the Muslims theirs. Not like what we have here, but for the times, it was pretty enlightened. Interestingly, under Sharia law in the Ottoman Empire, in 1858, they decriminalized homosexuality, which is long before any countries did in Europe. Andalusian Spain, in Muslim rule in Andalusian Spain, allowed Jewish and Christian scholars like Maimonides to thrive. Also, in many of these countries, they had grand wazirs. Grand wazirs, equivalent to a prime minister today, the second only to the Sultan, who were in some cases Jewish. And I'm not saying this is every Muslim everywhere. There was diversity. So Islam varies. What a lot of people are talking about today is Islamism. It's a modern political ideology from the likes of Sayyid Qutb and Maududi. This was a response to colonialism and Western hegemony. It is political. It's dressed up in Islamic clothes, true, but it is a political ideology where people only care about power and they don't care about spirituality. This isn't Islam. It's not an Islam that I recognize. It's not an Islam that most of the world's 1.9 billion Muslims would recognize. But of course, it has its followers, just like any of these extremist groups and political movements. But the Quran says, whoever kills a soul, it is as if he has slain all of mankind. And whoever has saved a life, it is as if they have saved all of mankind. I will leave it there for the questions and answers. I don't want to take too much time.